People will deny something or attribute it to another factor that caused their failure rather than embracing their own failure as a building block for success.
Welcome to Aspire, and I Have the Right To podcast, where we amplify voices, share stories, and drive change in the fight against sexual assault. We explore the critical issues surrounding student safety, institutional accountability, and survivor empowerment. In every episode, our goal is to provide insightful conversations with survivors, experts, educators, and advocates, giving you, our listener, valuable information, resources, and actionable steps to create safer environments and cultivate a culture of respect and consent. Today, I'm joined again by Gabriel Viscogliosi and Hugh Eastman, and the topic of the moment is failure. And we want to dive into the topic of failure and discuss how it impacts or maybe conflicts with what we talk about each week in terms of aspirational masculinity. So we're going to dive into this discussion. And maybe my first question to you, Hugh and Gabriel, is to ask about, when I say the word failure, what goes through your mind and how do you feel?
Well, I think there is so many negative connotations that people think of when you think of failure. And for me, immediately when I think of failure, initially I do have that negative reaction, oh, failure, kind of shying away from that idea, because so many times people think of failure and that's a bad thing. But there's just this one quote that I always think of, and by Michael Jordan, and it's, I failed over and over and over again in my life, and that's why I succeed. And I think that's such a key thing to point out, because failure is actually, instead of it being a negative thing, I think it's really important for people to switch that idea and switch it to it being a very positive thing. Because in order to truly succeed and to truly go outside of your comfort zone, you need to fail, because people will never really develop as a person and expand who they are without failing. And to truly be that aspirational masculine version of yourself and not kind of restricting yourself to that socially confined version, you'll never really experience failure if you kind of confine yourself.
So let me, I understand what you're saying, Gabriel. Let me ask a question about that in terms of when you have felt failure, how has that made you feel? And what has your response been to that?
At times, it has pushed me back a little bit, because I think when you experience that failure, you kind of feel a sense of sadness and maybe regret that you did that thing that caused you failure. But after I have those first moments of regret and sadness, I then come to accept that I did fail, but I understand why I failed and how I failed, so I can continue to go at that same problem again, but not do it the same way as to why I failed, but alter it so that next time I don't fail.
A lot of people get wrapped up in the concept of failure and success, and they forget who they really are. And there's a narrow vision of what people define success as based on what job you have or how much money you make. And I think that pushes people back from really embracing who they actually are. And people, rather than living their life to the full extent, people look at failure and say, I can't do this just because of how scary that seems, or what will people think of me? What's going to happen to my reputation if I don't succeed in this way, or if I don't make this certain amount of money? And like Gabriel was saying, that just pulls people back from their true self.
So when thinking of failure, and especially with the lens of looking at men, I think we can all agree that failure is viewed as a sign of weakness. And what is one of the things that we've talked about in our previous episodes, the last thing that a traditional man, wants to be viewed as in our society, right? It's weakness, correct?
Yes.
But I've heard you both talk about failure being an opportunity to improve. So let me flip this around and maybe get your reactions or even examples of seeing maybe friends who failed in front of you, whether it be in an academic sense, in terms of failed in terms of their friendship or academically. What has been your view of people that you've seen failed?
The first step in every instance is denial, that people will deny something or attribute it to another factor that caused their failure rather than embracing their own failure as a building block for success. That people separate success and failure with this defining line, and rather than doing that, failure should be used as this building block or this experience that changes your outlook on success or a certain way to improve.
But have you ever looked at a close friend who failed a test or failed in some component of a friendship, and have you had a negative reaction to that? Have you said, "Boy, what an idiot," or "He didn't study at all," or have you had that reaction?
When I've seen my friends being in denial of this failure, or rather than not embracing it, it's hard to understand the perspective on failure, whether this person, say my friend failed a test, my first step is to see where they're coming from and to help them through it. And for a lot of men and boys, there's a lot of backlash when it comes to that. And I think that ties into socially constructed masculinity in the way that many men and boys will say, I can do this myself. I'm not actually a failure. Get off me. So I think that kind of reaction to it is also in a similar way, like a denial of failure rather than an embracement of it.
And when you do experience failure, or when one of your peers experiences failure, but you're there with them, who you're there with and their reaction to it plays a massive role in shaping how you go on with failure in the future. Because if one of my peers tries something new, but they fail, I kind of see their reaction to this failure. I always make it my biggest priority to try to help support them and make sure that they know that what they did wasn't wrong and it's okay to do it again and try. Because when you, at least in my own experience, when I have failed something, but I've had a negative reaction from my peers or from family, whoever it may be, then I feel like I don't really want to do it again. And there's no reason for me to do it again because I'm only going to get a negative backlash. But when the people who you're surrounding yourself with support you after you fail, it really kind of changes your complete narrative on failing and making it so it's actually okay to fail.
Also, it goes the other way where when people think that they've succeeded in a certain concept of their life or in a certain way, I think that the reaction plays a role into how people will continue working at it. Because I think, say you've written kind of this essay that you're proud of or something in school, and someone says, "Oh, that sucks. That's not a good essay," but you feel proud of it. That draws you back from working on the next project. That reaction plays a role into how people conceive success and failure.
This is an interesting discussion because I heard you talk about a concept here that has been a theme for us in terms of encouragement and support. Gabriel, you talked about giving encouragement and support to friends versus a lot of what we see out in the broader world is mocking and grief when people fail. There seems to be a large and willing group of people that are looking, it seems, for failures and looking to mock or give grief to people who fail. And possibly because it's hard to understand. But if I think from myself, there have been times where I see a fail and I will laugh. And I will sometimes say, boy, why am I laughing at this person's failure? Does it make me feel better to see someone who's messing up, right, somehow? And I think this whole concept of understanding that for any of us to improve, we have to go through failure. That thought makes me wonder, do we need more encouragement and support out there in the world? And then how do we do that in a way that can help everybody, right? Because if you believe in what goes around comes around, the last thing we would want is to be mocked for our own failures, right? So let me get some thoughts from you guys on that.
Many people these days often have that same reaction to seeing other people fail because it kind of gives them that comfort of being like, oh, okay, someone else failed. Haha, let me kind of just turn into something funny without realizing what failure actually is, because they have that fear of failure and they don't really want to think about it. So I think they often use humor to really push that idea away and kind of make it so it's something it's not. But in reality, I think people who experience failure should actually be celebrated instead of really pushed down, because if you are experiencing failure, that means you're trying something new or just kind of pushing yourself outside of your own comfort zone. Instead of all those people who make fun of people who try new things and fail, it should really be a more unified thing, and people should really recognize that failure is actually a good thing. And I think that comes from the idea that people need to come together when people fail and bring them up instead of pushing them down. And when you do push other people up, it makes yourself feel better. And I think once people realize and experience that feeling of pushing people up makes yourself feel better, it only adds to a greater feeling of happiness. And you just want to do it again because it feels so good for you and for the other person.
Going back to the idea of humor and like laughing at people who fail, I think that a lot of that comes from insecurity and the idea that maybe that person who's laughing at it has failed before and has received a similar reaction and is deflecting that reaction onto this other person like a disease is definitely like prevalent in many ways of life. And I think that once people realize that, changing our reaction to people's either success or failure will make you feel like you've succeeded in a sense, and in support of that person. And I don't think that putting someone down and laughing at them when they fail will make you feel better in any sense. But I think that's a reaction that has been constructed by society as a way of expressing insecurity and fear of failure in society.
Let's talk about the pressure to succeed a little bit and societal expectations, because, I love how you guys are embracing this topic, but I really still feel it a lot of what you're saying is running counter to the existing culture that exists in the atmospheres of the different places that I know that I reside in. And I'm imagining it does for you, whether it be on your sports teams or in the hallways of schools or out on the weekends, out socially. But when we talk about traditional masculinity, the concept of failure to me still feels like failure, right? Something that should be turned away from, that should be avoided at all costs, that represents signs of weakness, signs of not being able to be what you're meant to be as a man.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest, if not the biggest, kind of forms of failure as a man in this socially constructed view is not being a provider and not being able to provide for your family or provide for your loved ones and people you care about. And I think that idea of being a provider and you having to be a provider as a man is one that's been so deeply ingrained in our society, and one that's so hard to really go away from, that men are constantly kind of being pushed down this path. And I think, at least for me, in high school, I've had this thought that success has to come from me going to a super prestigious college, and then after that going to a job that provides me with a lot of money, and then from there going up the ranks and making more money and more money, because that's the way that I'll be able to provide for my future family. And I think so many men only think that that's the only way that they can provide, by going down this very narrow path of making a large amount of money, but I think there's so many different ways of success and different ways of providing that can really be explored. That's not just this one narrow definition.
It's interesting because what you just went through, the litany of things you just went through, Gabriel, didn't include anything about character, about what kind of man you are. It was all focused primarily on financial accumulation or other sort of label accumulation. And that definitely seems to be the one of the primary goals, because we do hear this man as a provider theme everywhere. And that is a very limiting definition of a man that can really put blinders, on you. And it's interesting, as juniors in high school, you're feeling that pressure pretty heavily right now, right?
Definitely. And I think with this idea of character that you're talking about, I think in this narrow path, it's okay and normalized to really sacrifice character and your moral sense if that means you can achieve more money. And I think it's even supported that it's okay to throw away your character and your morals if that means you can make more money and be a better provider. And I think that whole narrative really needs to really be switched around and instead prioritize the idea of morals and your character by putting that first, because that's what really makes you a true good man instead of just putting the money first always.
Yeah, I agree on the idea of what is enough, and in some ways how people can't really define it. Reminds me of this movie I just watched called Wall Street, which kind of goes through the life of a stockbroker who gets caught up in insider trading and does anything really to just achieve this idea of success portrayed by society. And you can see how slowly he starts to lose all of his morals and what he stands for. And I think that movie really stuck with me and is really an example of how people will abandon those morals and their view of society and people in their life just to achieve monetary success. And I think that's a mindset that a lot of people have, sadly. And it's definitely something that we need to change. I thought that movie just really stuck with me because I think that it was a great example to see how someone could be so wrapped up in that idea of success. And you see how he starts off as a more humble character and goes and changes into this monster. And so I think that people's perceptions of failure and success should change. And I think at least that's an example of how the dangers of living by this idea of failure and success portrayed by society.
So I want to get a little bit personal here now and hear from you some examples of failure that you've had. Because I think we've all experienced failure, but I think we all have a different way of processing that failure. And then what does that failure turn into? It can open up several different paths or options for you. Would love to dive into some personal examples and see what it did for you, right? What did you learn from that particular failure?
When I was younger, I always loved to cook and was passionate about the idea of being a chef growing up until I was about 12 years old. And then as this idea of money and success defined by the rest of society began to creep into my 12-year-old mind, I started to get more discouraged from that idea. And I had people telling me that's not, that you can't really achieve success in that field. How are you gonna be able to live like that? So I think that drew me away from that. And although I think I don't really still want to be a chef, but I think that just seeing how that kind of infected my younger mind and the effect that has on so many younger kids from pursuing their dreams and aspirations is really sad to see. So I think that needs to be changed, definitely.
That's something that you and I have in common, Hugh. Food and cooking was a passion of mine from the time I was born. And I did have aspirations myself to be a chef. to own a restaurant. And I went as far as getting an application for a cooking school in Europe when I was getting very sick of investment banking and the long hours and the bizarre focus that it forced on you. But, I hope you continue pursuing that passion, because it is a wonderful passion to pursue and it's something you can do for the rest of your life. My favorite hobby now is cooking, and then traveling and experiencing new food and new cultures and new tastes and new people and ways of thinking. It's a wonderful pursuit that you can do for the rest of your life. But Gabriel, sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, no, I also have a pretty similar, I would say, experience to Hugh. One that I think kind of remains pretty present in my mind is I also, when I was younger, I've always wanted to be an architect, but I've been pushed away from that idea from, as you talked about, kind of the monetary restrictions. But I think also when I really look at people that I deemed as successful, they all were kind of in that one path of finance and their services. But I've talked to my parents about this a lot, and they've kind of shown me how there's so many people that are so successful in so many different fields. And I've read a lot about this and how by really being successful, and you can also make so much money this way as well if you want to kind of have this monetary success, is by actually being very passionate about what you want to do, and having that passion will eventually gain you that monetary success or whatever type of success you want. And I have been pulled away, I would say, from that architecture dream, but the idea of houses and real estate and finance has still been interesting to me. But I think so many people do get pulled off that idea, like you said, of their dream job when they want as a kid. But I think the one main thought I would make sure our listeners remember is that you can truly be successful in whatever occupation you want. And it's just if you have that passion and that drive to really do that occupation and that job, that you will be successful in that. It's just how much you actually like it. And I think it's super important for people to enjoy whatever job they do have and not just do something straight for the money, because then they will lose who they truly are as a person.
So that word passion is something I want to dive into here now, because I think it's incredibly important. Hugh, I'm going to pivot back to you in cooking, because it seemed like you had a passion for cooking as a youngster. And I'm sure as you were experimenting or working in the kitchen, practicing, that there were plenty of failure. Do you have anything that exists in your mind? And what did that failure do?
One time I remember making a chocolate cake, and it really just was horrible. And the way that people reacted to that also was discouraging, or discouraged me from that dream as well. In that way, people telling me, like, rather than saying like the reaction of, oh, maybe try again, maybe you can do better next time and make something better than that, people were like, are you really passionate about this? Do you actually want to be a chef? Or like, what's going on and why are you failing? Was this question that I think people were posing, rather than how can you improve on your failure?
So interesting. So the response externally was very important to you then.
Yes, I think so. Because I think that even though I knew I blew up that cake and there's no way that someone would have thought that it tasted good, I think that I felt initially, oh, maybe I can try this again, do something better. But people were like, get out of the kitchen. Like, why are you making, what are you doing here? And why are you, yeah.
Then I'm going to challenge you. Do you think really that was a passion of yours?
I think so. I think that I was mainly like a baker in my time. So I made a lot of cakes and cookies and always tried to perfect them. And I think that I did, to a certain extent, have a dream, whether, even though I was younger, it's harder to tell what you actually want to do. But I was definitely very passionate about cooking and baking. But I think that people's reactions strayed me away from that. And maybe that, in a way, rather than cooking and baking in our kitchen, I could have done some culinary program or actually expanded on my interests later. So I think that in that way, it was something that didn't seem like completely, oh, this could be my job just because I like cooking and baking in our kitchen. But I think that the way that people restricted its development caused it to fall apart.
And I think also, as you were saying about this idea of failure in his childhood, I think that is such a large connotation between failure and being a child, because I think being a child, you're more allowed to fail. I know in Hugh's experience, he didn't really experience that, but I think since you're at this young age, you're really allowed to explore a lot of different things. And then as you grow up, though, even when you're kind of 10 or 12, those options of failure really stop. And at such a young age, even let's say 12, your ability and kind of opportunity to fail or be allowed to fail from other people is really narrowed down and really stopped. And then as you grow older and older, that view of failure becomes even more narrow and more narrow as you continue to grow older. Instead, I think it should continue to expand, because I think a large issue that many people in our society have is that you're only able to fail or really experience failure when you're younger, because then you can pivot from that. But I think so many people don't understand that it's never too late to really pivot and actually do what you love, because if you do what you love, that's when you'll truly find success, and not trying to be stuck down some road that you don't like, but you're too scared to fail and experience failure that now you're an adult. Okay, I'm stuck down this path. But people need to realize that it's actually okay to fail no matter where you are in life, and you can always really reinvent yourself and become that new version of yourself by truly finding success and not being afraid to fail no matter what time period it is in your life.
I just had an interesting visual picture in my mind in terms of a narrowing as you get older. As you said, Gabriel, that the allowances for failure decrease the older that you get, which then in my mind says the risk reward for taking risks also narrows, right? And therefore, there might be more hesitation to take risks because you want to avoid failures. But that really runs counter to, the concept of success and pursuit of passions and things that you love to do. And that to me, I absolutely remember and recognize from my earlier days. And I think that's a real shame. It seems to me that the busyness of your guys' lives on a daily basis, how do you find space and time for taking those risks and pursuing those passions?
I think that if you are truly passionate about something, you will find time to do it. So I think that's a good marker of it. And I know, and Gabriel and I are juniors, and there's kind of not a lot of time sometimes to do things you like, and you're caught up in a lot of work. And I know that's a similar experience for many people in their life. But I think that people will, if you really do like something and if you really do want to expand on it, you will cut out time for it.
So I have an interesting sort of reminiscence from this, going back to my middle daughter, Chessie, who loved theater. And in her high school in Florida, she pursued theater and she was in all the musicals. And I remember they had a wonderful head of the theater program, a gentleman named Mark Danny, who was so passionate about the theater program and performing all of these wonderful shows and musicals. And one year they were able to convince several of the popular athlete young men to join the program. And they were putting on this great version of High School Musical. And one of the star athletes raised his hand to do it and convinced several of his friends to do it. And they might have started it as a little bit of a lark, but I think they quickly learned how serious and how much hard work and practice needs to go into putting on a top-class show. And it was one of the sort of most amazing experiences to see these young men taking risks, putting themselves out there, singing and performing and dancing. And you could see them evolving and growing in ways that they probably couldn't imagine, being out there on the stage, fully exposed, completely vulnerable. And I just found it one of the most amazing things to see. But it also shows me that the attributes of leadership and being vulnerable and the power of that and taking risks and being an example for others. And just, have you guys seen examples of that? Have you experienced things like that in your school careers?
I have, at least with writing and trying to take a different style to, let's say, an essay that I'm trying to write. And I've thought about taking a more creative style or a different style, but I've restricted myself because I'm scared that maybe it won't work out. But if instead I try to really go that extra mile and try something different and really be creative, then I maybe would have gotten that better grade that I wished, because I actually did take that risk. But since I never did take that risk, I never know. As Wayne Gretzky said, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So I think it's so important that people really take that risk and learn to accept failure if you do fail, because it's better to know that you tried it.
I'll say something that it's weird to think about, considering like this whole journey that we've been on. But Alex, with the consent summit, I think the first GDS consent summit, when we first met, there was a lot of hesitancy as a boy to be part of that. And in that sense, there was like this vulnerability and this kind of passion that you had to stand by despite people's reactions saying like, why are you going on that? And I'm sure that's a reaction prevalent in many other boys who did go on that summit. But I think that that's just one example I think of that allowed me and many others to put ourselves out there. And with this journey of meeting you and starting this podcast, I think that shows how far that this can really go, just taking one extra step despite people's reactions.
That is, very meaningful to hear from you, Hugh. And I can imagine, if I reflect on that, it's not an easy step for both of you to take, to put yourselves out there. Talk about vulnerability and taking a risk and taking a dive, being co-hosts of a podcast talking about aspirational masculinity. But nothing changes without examples out there. And I think that's the key thing for us to talk about, redefining what it means to be a success, or looking at success differently. Because the evolution, the learning, the skills that you guys are developing through these difficult conversations are things that I believe truly are going to be better equip you for life ahead. And I think you guys were very well armed to begin with from the day one that I met you guys at the summit. Taking these risks each week in terms of the topics that we talk about, the challenges that we give ourselves to challenge the way that we think and the way that we process things. All it is really is girded towards how do we make ourselves the best versions of ourselves. And I think if we're truly honest, that we're going to realize that being the best version of yourself is something that failure is a major component of. Failure is actually not a detour on this journey of being the best version of ourselves, but it's actually an important component of it. Actually, it's probably the most important component, because we can only really learn through failure, because those things tend to sear in ourselves. And it's something that really is easy to remember. But does that sort of make sense to you guys?
Yeah, I think that definitely resonates very deeply with me. And I think what you were saying about that best version of yourself, I think you can be a decent version of yourself if you don't experience failures, but you will never be able to be that best version of yourself if you don't go outside your comfort zone, if you don't take risks, if you don't experience failure, because then you'll never really see what you're truly capable of, and you'll never truly see the boundaries of where you can go if you don't experience failure. Because if you don't experience failure, you're not pushing yourself enough.
So how do we get this message out there to other young people? Because I think the expectations in society are we should be striving for quote unquote perfectionism, right? And we should be minimizing failures, and we should be taking therefore less risks and making yourself less vulnerable, especially as men. And how do we reshape the conversation to say, no, we have it absolutely wrong? It's our character development, our learning ability. You used examples that I think all of us have heard before, whether it's the Wayne Gretzky example or the Michael Jordan example. And I think most pro athletes will say that's something that, you learn from your failures, right? Your successes are not teachable moments, right? But it seems that message is not really acknowledged on a day-to-day basis in how we live our lives. So how can we change things?
I think that the first step is identifying what you're genuinely passionate about, because I think that, and it's okay if you don't really know yet, but then I would encourage people to think of what interests them or what they will get excited by when talking about. So I think that the first step is identifying that passion, and rather than the denial of saying, I can't do that because of this fear of failure, or this, it doesn't fall into this narrow definition of success. I think that the second step would be to cut out the noise of people and their reactions to what you really want to do. And then from there, it's just up to how much you really are passionate about and how much you really enjoy a certain topic, because I think that will draw you to achieve in your mind a certain level of success based on how fully you live your life and how freely you live your life rather than narrowly.
And I think at the end of the day, it all does come down to yourself and doing something that makes yourself happy, and not worrying as much about what other people think it's going to happen if you fail, but not worrying about other people's opinions or other people's feelings towards you failing, but really focus on what makes you happy. And if you do something that makes you happy and you fail the first time, why stop? It makes you happy. Do it again, try it again, and try it again, and keep on doing it until it does work, because that's what makes you happy and that's what you're really interested in. So go towards that instead of going towards what other people think and kind of going towards this narrative of other people, but really focus on yourself, and whatever you do and find yourself doing that makes you the happiest, continue down that path, because that's where you will find your own true success.
Well said, Gabriel. And I think what you're really talking about is defining success for yourself and not letting other people define it for you. Thank you so much for listening. Like and subscribe to the podcast on all platforms. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends about Aspire. Follow us on social media at I Have the Right To. Learn more about our student and executive programming at our website at ihavetherightto.org.